Welcome to PICT Voices, the interview series conducted by faculty of the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking with notable members of the broader PICT community. Our goal is to present our community with a variety of voices across the spectrum of the humanities and critical creative thinking. My name is Kristof Vanhoutte, and today it is my great honor to be joined by Cardinal Michael Czerny, S.J., Undersecretary of the Migrants and Refugees section of the Holy See's Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. Hello and welcome, Father Michael.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Now, for good understanding, I called you SJ. This is not a curse word. It simply stands for the Society of Jesus, and thus I basically said that you, just like Pope Francis, are a Jesuit. Now, before we start our conversation, we decided that a preliminary sentence of explanation might be appropriate on this occasion. It is in fact the first of hopefully many occasions that a representative of a religious institution appears on one of our podcasts. Now, PICT is an institute of education and research. Even more, we are a critical educational institution. And it is for this reason that we might not agree on everything that will be said in what follows, but it is also for that specific reason that it is fundamental that we have this conversation. Having said that, I have to admit that I am particularly pleased that you agreed to talk to me, as not only does your expertise cover fields that are of interest to us at PICT as well, but also because you are not simply someone who knows how things work at the upper echelons of the Church, which you obviously do as a cardinal, but also that you have been involved above all else in how things work at the lower levels and on the field. But before we discuss into more detail some of the more personal aspects of your expertise, I would like to start with you as a prince of the Catholic Church and treat a topic that has been haunting us all for the past year, the COVID-19 pandemic. And please allow me to be very direct. Now, I have to admit that up until today, I have not been able to understand the policy of the Vatican hierarchy. I really do not understand why the Church has little to say beyond telling people that they should follow what their respective governments decree. Now, of course, I understand that it would not have been easy for the Vatican to ask people to disobey their governments, although this has been done on other occasions and regarding other topics. But I think that the reductive take most governments have taken on this virus, focusing purely on the biological survival of every human being, whilst sidelining the intellectual, cultural, and above all spiritual needs of us humans, could have justified this different take. Schools have been closed, artistic venues have been shut down, and many religious services have been cancelled. But human life is not just biological survival. So my question to you is, would it have been appropriate for an institution like the Catholic Church to take a more proactive stance in defending and addressing people's spiritual needs in a situation like this?
Yes, thanks for the good question. And it's interesting that you ask it in this way because it communicates the distressing poverty, the bleakness of life for many people in this COVID time. But your question is maybe based on thinking too much of the Vatican as if that was what was running everything in the Church, whereas what you have to ask yourself in any situation, whether it's in a city or a region, a province, a district, or in a whole country, what is the Church doing, and what has the Church, how has the Church been responding? And there you will find a huge variety of responses which meet the very needs that you're talking about. In other words, I think you've pitched your gaze too high, and you're not seeing actually what's going on, let's say, around you, where you will find that spiritual and even cultural needs are being met in very creative ways, and people are finding ways of reaching out to each other. And many times these activities or these initiatives are indeed organized by the local parish, by a local religious order of sisters or priests like us Jesuits, or by Catholic organizations like Caritas or many others. They have so many different names in different places. So, but what the Holy Father has been doing, and in that sense, the Vatican, is a constant accompanying of this tragic process throughout the world with his gestures, with his ceremonies, and with his teaching that I think for many has been practically the only source of exactly the kind of leadership that you have been seeking in your question. In other words, addressing people's human, cultural, spiritual, family needs, and not just thinking that this is a narrowly defined medical emergency which is going to find a technical solution.
Oh, no, thank you. And I think my question was a provocation. I obviously know that the church is not just the Vatican, but this is generally what people see. And so I'm very happy with how you answered, because in the end, I think that's the most important part of religion, which is the base work. And that's why also.
In fact, our section, Migrant and Refugee section, we published practically since the beginning of the pandemic, we've published a weekly bulletin telling people what the responses, illustrating the responses of church groups, parishes, and so on around the world, a weekly thing. So there was, and I can assure you, there was plenty of material to publish. So if you want to review those issues, you will get a panorama of responses that I think will not only answer your question, but warm your heart.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, please allow me one more question about COVID, and one that unfortunately is connected to the very difficult subject of death. Now, all too many COVID deaths are deaths without closure. Many COVID patients die in hospitals where they are alone, without the chance to make their peace with family members or loved ones, and the Pope also denounced this in his recent encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti. Now, for followers of the Catholic Church, the issue of closure is compounded in that these lonely deaths take place without the possibility of the final sacrament. Now, as the representative of an institution concerned with spiritual well-being above all else, but also as a human being, could you share your perspective on this issue of death without closure, particularly in the case of so many COVID-19 deaths, but also more generally, please?
Well, it's of course it's the ideal and everyone's hope to die peacefully, surrounded by family, and comforted also by the Church, by the final sacraments, and by the feeling that the community in which one has lived and the faith life one has had is now coming to fulfillment, rather than suddenly being cut off. However, it's unfortunately true that many people, long before COVID, have been dying alone, uncared for, disconnected, and really discarded. So, if, in that sense, your question might be the larger question of how contemporary society deals with death. And if you want a Catholic point of view, I would say that one of the problems, not the greatest, but one of the problems are the obstacles that are sometimes put that make it more difficult for people to be accompanied. But in this year of COVID, again, I think if you look for the examples which are the answers to your question, not statements, but examples, you'll find many extraordinary examples, which include, for example, priests accompanying somebody through a hospital window, if the window was accessible. If they weren't allowed into the room, at least they were just outside the room, and then simultaneously on the cell phone, or priests or sisters or other chaplains, lay chaplains who did manage to get permission to put on all the protective gear and to go in and be with the people in their troubled times. And in fact, one of my companions, a priest in Chicago, did exactly that, and that's where he got COVID, by accompanying somebody who was dying. So again, there are examples which in a sense, respond to your question. And unfortunately, there are other many instances, and I think that's the bigger problem. And this is something that the Holy Father's been talking about a lot also, is the apartheid to which we subject the old. So it's not that they die alone as if they were with us during life, but they are separated out and put away long before they die. So dying alone is only the fulfillment of the sin, you might say, that as societies and even as economies, we don't seem to know how to keep our old people with us, and that's a big problem, a very big problem.
Yeah, I already had an earlier podcast with Professor Finkelstein from New York, and she said very similar things as you're saying now. So it's unfortunate that this is confirmed all over the world. Now, you have never shied away from a controversial stand if you believed it was true. I remember your positioning during the so-called condom debate, where you claimed to great anger from certain corners that the condom alone would not stop the HIV/AIDS crisis, that a spiritual cure was needed as well. Now, I have no desire to rehash that debate, but I think your position is relevant to the current discussion surrounding COVID vaccinations. It seems that once more we have a technical solution, the vaccine in this case, which would lead to the possibility that we just can forget the whole COVID experience and return to life as normal. Now, do you think we are missing the spiritual cure once again? And how would a spiritual cure look like, in your opinion?
Well, the spiritual cure is again what Pope Francis has been developing and communicating now for a whole year, and that is that the worst pandemic is not COVID. The worst pandemic is the individualism which has been enshrined and is reinforced especially by the economic system, which isolates and individuates people to the point that they are competing instead of cooperating, and that the profit motive without qualifier or political supervision is the unique driver. And this is an impoverishment of our life together that is costing us now very, very dearly. And COVID has put, as they say, the magnifying glass or the microscope on this ailment of our system, of our global economic order or disorder, whatever you wish to call it, and has highlighted the fault lines. And the fault lines, the fundamental fault line, is the individualizing and you might say the sanctification of selfishness and self-interest. And while these are part of life and an essential part of life, they cannot be the drivers. They cannot be the drivers of our socio-economic, cultural, political being together. And unfortunately, that is what we seem to be reduced. So COVID is a tragedy for many. It is a terrible affliction for nearly everyone. We can hardly wait to stop with it and to get on to other things. But it is also an opportunity to recalibrate or to refocus or to restructure the way in which we live together, what our Holy Father calls how we run or how we manage our common home and how we behave in our family, our common human family. And this recalibration or reorientation, this restart is very, very, very important. And you don't need COVID to convince you of it. You can list 10 or 20 other issues, which I'm sure you've talked about on your program, each of which could argue that in order to meet this issue, we need a restart, we need a recalibration, we need a reorientation. And as Pope Francis says, these crises are all interconnected, interrelated. And so we have a chance to give a kind of a systematic response to our dilemmas. The question is, The question is, are we going to take advantage of this sad opportunity, or are we going to just rush back to what we call or used to call normal, which is normal for relatively few and is miserable for many. And this really should be for each and every one of us. This should become utterly unacceptable.
Thanks for this. Now, I would like to turn to a different topic, a topic that I know to be very near and dear to your heart, namely migration. As I mentioned when I introduced you, you are the Undersecretary of the Migrants and Refugees section of the Dicastery for promoting integral human development. But you are also someone with personal experience of migration and its effect. Your own family migrated from Czechoslovakia to Canada when you were only 2 years old. So my first question combines the personal and the vocational. Can you tell us a bit more about your own experience as a child in a migrant family? And how does your work of the Migrants and Refugees section relate to your own experience?
Well, maybe to begin with the last, I would say that I've been in the migrants, or been working in the Migrants and Refugee section now since the beginning of 2017. And I can tell you that until then, I'm not sure that I was so constantly aware of being a migrant or a refugee or a displaced person. Of course, I knew it, but maybe because the issues I was dealing with didn't touch on it so explicitly. Anyway, it wasn't so. So vital for me. But when I started to work in Migrants and Refugees section and began to hear what people who have been displaced, what they've gone through and what their experiences have been, the answers to the very same questions that you're asking me now. When I heard others answering those questions, I began to say, well, but we went through that too. I know what they're talking about. That's not just that's not just a story I'm listening to. That's an echo of what I've lived. And so that's when I began to realize that maybe my own life has been more marked by this early experience and lifelong experience than I had realized. And to such an extent that when I became a cardinal just over a year and a half ago, for my coat of arms, my emblem, I chose what would be like a lifeboat with 4 people, a family of parents and two children, which was what we were, in a boat on the sea. And that is a symbol also of the church, but also an expression of what we ourselves did. And yes, I would say the difficult questions about where you belong. When you say home, that usually has a family connotation, and home is wherever my family is. Home is wherever I feel at home. But beyond home, then where do you belong? And do I actually belong where I was born? Do I belong where I grew up and where I'm a citizen? Or do I belong where I am living my life and dedicating my life? Where's home? And is there actually, do any of us have a home that we can go back to once we have, moved on? These may be more philosophical or even poetic questions, but they're important because which is what your questions are going to come to, then when we have resistance to migration and prejudice, then it's based on a false concept of a kind of stability and a kind of right, my right to be here and my right to be of this, carrying this label. This is something much more ephemeral than perhaps defenders of like to think. And having been a migrant, I know it from inside.
Yeah, thank you for this. Now, remaining on the topic of migration, you have ruffled some feathers by claiming that the so-called migration crisis is not really a crisis, but mainly a series of mismanagements and poor policies and self-interest manipulations. I basically agree with that. May I ask you, however, to elaborate on this position? What are the mismanagements and the manipulations you talk about, and why do they come about, and who benefits from them, you think?
Well, one way of answering your question is to look at the word crisis and to see how it's used. And the expression "the world migration crisis," you see, is a construct which doesn't tell you anything except, but it's very good for generating fear. And this is what we have both inadvertently and maybe deliberately done, is to generate an atmosphere of fear and of confusion around this very, 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 very normal phenomenon of the movement of peoples. I don't want to seem prejudiced, but I have the impression that you're not a native of the country from which you are calling me, just as I'm not a native of the country from which I'm responding. So here we have 100% mobility in our little community of two, and if you look around your institute and count how many people are from somewhere else, I suspect you would get well over 50%.
Yes.
So, okay, so the word crisis then is misplaced when it's put, in my opinion, and this ruffles the feathers maybe, it's misplaced when it's put at too high a level, because then it's, instead of opening the door to solutions, it rather creates blockages. The crisis, the real crisis, is for the family. The real crisis is for the young person who has fled from where they grew up because there's absolutely no future, or because they're being persecuted, or because they belong to the wrong religion, race, color, or whatever. That's the crisis. And that crisis is a crisis that you and I can deal with, and we should. And Pope Francis is very wise. He says we are obliged to welcome and integrate people on the move up to the point where we cannot absorb anymore. Okay? But have you reached the point where you could not absorb another stranger in your environment? I haven't, and you haven't, and most of our listeners, in fact, I would say none of our listeners has. None of us is overcome by a crisis. So if we don't experience the crisis, then why is it a crisis? Let's stop talking about the crisis and let's look at reasonable and viable and proven approaches, policy approaches like community sponsorship, which allows ordinary people to cluster in groups of 10 or 20 and put their minds and hearts and resources together and welcome a family into their lives. And everyone who does that, practically without exception, says it's a wonderful experience. It's called the Canadian model, and it's highly to be recommended. When you do that kind of thing, then you say, don't talk to me about crisis.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But I think this is mainly the Western look. If you look at other parts of the globe, I think we can actually speak of real crisis, where there are wars who are devastating whole countries. There's famine and disease. So maybe when you say that the crisis, there is no crisis, you mean a westernized world. But then in other parts of the world, there are true crises of migration, of war.
No. Wait, no, that's exactly. Now you're doing exactly the same thing. You're putting migration into the same list with war and persecution and drought and earthquakes and invasions. That's not right. Migration is a reasonable human response to difficulties. It's not itself. It's not itself. It's not in the same list with war, and it's not in the same list with persecution. It's not in the same list with dire poverty. No. Migration is a reasonable human response to a difficulty. And we wouldn't be the human family we are if our ancestors didn't respond to the depleting resources in one place in order to move to another. Right?
Okay.
Or we're not all where we started from. So let's use the word crisis modestly where it belongs, and then really face those crises. All the energy spent worrying or lamenting migration, if that energy were spent on nuclear disarmament, and especially on stopping the arms trade, that alone would help get our world also out of its crises, including COVID. If we would stop countries like the ones from which both of you and I are talking, we would stop producing weapons for sale and fueling the conflicts which drive people from their homes. Not to mention what our way of life does in terms of the poverty elsewhere. No? Is that right?
Yes.
So don't let me hear you talking about migration crisis ever again.
Okay.
Thank you.
We might disagree on this, but I will not talk about this on this podcast anymore. Now, the exploitation I asked you to address just in my previous question is, of course, not only about politics and the economy. It also concerns another issue that is very important to you, namely the environment. Now, we know that the environmental degradation that goes hand in hand with political and economic exploitation is an important factor in making refugees out of settled populations. Now, you have been one of the main voices in the Vatican's recent green turn. Could you tell us how you connect the dots between the environment and your other areas of interest?
Well, actually, right this very moment, we're putting the final touches on a new handbook, a new, what's called Pastoral Orientations for Climate Displaced People. So that is doing exactly what you're asking. How can the church respond? How can the church better respond to people who are displaced by the climate crisis? And that's so. Your question is exactly what we decided to face as our thematic focus last year, and now the booklet will be coming out, and it will join other booklets in which we have shown proposals, concrete ways of responding to the various dimensions of the difficulties of migrants and of refugees, then of human trafficking, of internally displaced people, and now of climate displaced people. So that's one concrete answer to your question.
Okay, and then to conclude, maybe in terms of the environment, Pope Francis seemed to have ushered in quite a revolutionary new wind, especially on the green field. Now, some harsh critics would say that it is too little, too late. How would you respond to those?
Well, I would respond that it is little. We won't know till afterwards if it was too little, but hopefully it's not too little. But it is little now, and it has to be more. It really has to be more, and that is along with COVID and the other list of urgent crises. This is a very, 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 very important one. So let's really hope and pray and struggle that it not be too little. About too late, maybe that's where you can conclude on a more religious note. Too late means that there's no hope, and that would be contrary to our Christian faith. There is no way that we could declare our human situation to be hopeless, because we believe that God is provident and will help us to help ourselves dig ourselves out of the mess we've put ourselves into. So I have hope in that. I have hope in God, and I have hope in people's goodness and willingness and generosity and this great capacity to respond to challenges. And I hope that our religious leadership will inspire our political leadership to organize us out of this mess that different forms of neglect and short-sightedness have gotten us into. And I conclude by thanking you for this nice interview, and I hope that you've enjoyed it and that your listeners will enjoy it as well.
Well, I would like to thank you as well for being with us. This has been a highly enlightening conversation. And I would also like to thank the listeners from my part who have joined us for one more episode of PICT Voices. Thank you, Father Michael. And my name is Kristof Vanhoutte. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.